What's happening, sports fans? I am Kendrick, the sports guy. Good Tuesday to you. Hope you're having a good start to your week. We're talking relationships that have fractured. Yeah, we're talking about the Pivot Podcast versus I Am Athlete, which is now headed by Brandon Marshall, who was the one that actually started the I Am Athlete podcast, and his original co-hosts were Channing Crowder, Fred Taylor, and Reggie Wayne. Fred Taylor and Channing Crowder had some issues with Brandon Marshall, or Brandon Marshall had some issues with them. It depends on which story you believe, what their thoughts on it. Well, they are having a back and forth, some war of words, so to speak. Brandon Marshall was on Cam Newton's Funky Friday podcast about a week ago, and the subject was brought up. Cam asked him about, his former co-host on I Am Athlete. Brandon Marshall will have a little bit to say, so you're going to hear some sound from Brandon Marshall first, and then you'll hear from Fred Taylor and Channing Crowder giving their reaction to some of what Marshall had to say about them, as well as Ryan Clark on the Cam Newton show, Funky Friday. So take a listen to Brandon Marshall and Channing Crowder and Fred Taylor. Then I'm going to come back and give my thoughts on what these guys had to say. Take a listen.
Channing Crowder, super talented. Fred Taylor, I don't have anything good to say about Fred Taylor.
No, don't say that. Don't say that, bro.
Well, all right, cool. Let me say it this way, Fred Taylor, the disappointment there is that, damn boy, you Funky Friday, you got me open, dog. I'm not supposed to be talking about this no more,
bro. But I'm being like this.
So Fred Taylor, we talking about solid OGs. Mm-hmm. That was my neighbor for 10 years, solid. You know what I mean? So that's the disappointment there. Is like, he's so solid. You know what I mean? And so you got that, and then Ryan Clark.
I think Brandon Marshall might be the biggest coward on the planet, simply because he's on his clout chasing tour. And I also kind of came across something that he said about Shannon Sharp, which is crazy. So why at this point in the game you're hopping around podcasts, talking about everybody? It's a bad look, and obviously I've read some of the comments, and a lot of people agree that he's embarrassing himself. But just a lot of lying, a lot of manipulative movements, pretty much how he was with everybody that he's encountered.
The part I heard was he made me. That's the thing I can't stand. How you make me when I made your podcast, or our podcast supposedly, but it really wasn't ours, as we found out. Then go to another one, create another thing that blows up bigger than that even was. That's the thing that got hot about me. Pauline Pope and Randy Crowder made me. I created myself. I do all this.
Now that was a lot to take in. Brandon Marshall, you couldn't see it because I could only use the sound. I can't use the video. It's owned by somebody else, but you couldn't see what Brandon Marshall's gestures were when Cam Newton asked him about Ryan Clark, who is now the host of Pivot Podcast. He kind of was like, and he actually would call him corny later on in that interview on Cam's podcast, Brandon Marshall. My thoughts on his take, I think Brandon Marshall ain't telling, he's withholding some information. He's only saying what makes him look good, and I get that. But I think he withheld some things. Now, his I Am Athlete podcast right now, I think it has almost 1 million subscribers, but it doesn't pull the numbers that, in my opinion, that the Pivot Podcast pulls. I watch the Pivot Podcast. I'm subscribed to him. I like Ryan Clark. I love Channing Crowder. I love Fred Taylor. I think their chemistry works. I did try to watch I Am Athlete with Brandon Marshall and his new crew. I just didn't like it. I wasn't really, I think Brandon Marshall's good on TV. I never really dug his style. A lot of times he would always interject himself into the topics. He would not allow his guests to really speak. So I never really cared for Brandon Marshall. I didn't even really care for him when he was on the original I Am Athlete, when it was just him, Ocho Cinco, Fred Taylor, and Channing Crowder. Now, to respond to Channing Crowder and Fred Taylor's comments. Fred is he's a quiet dude. You can pretty much tell if you watch. He doesn't say much, but when he say something, you pay attention. Because most of the time, those quiet dudes, those quiet people, they're gonna give you the truth, the unfiltered, unadulterated truth. And I believe Fred Taylor when he says that Brandon Marshall wasn't handling his business. I believe that, and I think that they helped that show, so they should be compensated for that. So again, sometimes you just can't go into business with friends. That's one of the things that I learned from this. As far as Channing Crowder, he's a funny cat. He kept it funky. He kept it 100, and I agree with his assessment. So at the end of the day, I think sometimes business will ruin friendships, and it's good to have the I's dotted and the T's crossed, and knowing what everybody is bringing to the table. And if you got to invest, put in. If you're not gonna put in, then you pay them a salary and leave it at that. I think it should have been that. So I hate to see this happening with the brothers, but I get it. It happens all the time. The Pivot Podcast is doing well. I Am Athlete, they still got a bunch of subscribers. They doing okay, but they're not on the level of Pivot Podcast. So I don't know. Again, sometimes relationships run their course, and there's enough room out here in the podcast streets for everybody to make a little money. I'd like to know what you guys think about this beef between Channing Crowder, Fred Taylor, Ryan Clark, and Brandon Marshall. Drop a comment. Whose side you on this? Make sure you drop a comment, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. I am Kendrick the Sports Guy. We will see you on the other side. And on the next report, I am out. Peace.